Okay, so as we said, my name is Belinda, and I'm going to talk to you today about reviewing TreeAge models. So this short webinar will highlight ways to review a TreeAge Pro model. What I hope you get out by the end of this webinar is that you'll get an overview of what the model is doing and what the important elements are. So you can open any TreeAge Pro model and fairly quickly know where to look so that you can understand what the model's doing. So we're going to examine a TreeAge Pro model and use different tools to quickly understand what the model does and how to appropriately analyze it. And that's going to prepare you should you need to examine and review a model built by somebody else at any point. So I've got a model open here, which is called a review model, and I'm happy to send this out to you guys to look at so you can kind of recreate what the webinar is doing after we finish today. But when you first open a model like this, you should always start by examining the structure. That's kind of one of the elements of TreeAge Pro that really speaks to modeling, is the fact that the structure is very visual. So you can see here in this particular model that I've got open that we've got a decision node down here, and you know that from the decision node the branches of those will be the strategies, and that will allow you to understand the alternatives that are being considered. So in this case we have a decision node and we're comparing standard of care, this one's called, versus a new therapy. So most models you get will start with a decision node, and then you can look at the branches of that to see what the strategies are that you're comparing. So the next important element when you've looked at what your strategies are that you're comparing is the patient pathways that are represented visually within TreeAge Pro, within this model structure. So basically by reviewing what happens in terms of the model structure here to the right of your strategy, you can see how patients are supposed to move through the model with the assumptions that have been made. So you can see here we've got basically a collection of nodes and branches within TreeAge. But for a reviewer, as you're looking at the model, what you want to do is be able to compare the model's pathways against your understanding of the underlying disease to gauge accuracy. So you want to understand whether the model that you're looking at has captured all the elements of the disease progression that you think are important in looking, I guess in this case, this is a cancer model with different stages of cancer and how the progression evolves. Okay, so that's kind of what the structure will allow you to do. Additional to that, most of the healthcare models you look at will also be Markov models. And this particular model that we're looking at is also a Markov model too. So what a Markov model does is it will break up the disease progression into health states and events which can recur over time. So you're kind of looking for those things too. So the health states are the branches of your Markov node. So in this case, you're looking to see if the disease has been broken down into, you know, what different states. So in this case, this has been broken down into, say, a cancer stage 1, a cancer stage 2, and a remission and a dead state. And you'll be checking for, you know, does that make sense? Is that accurately what I need to represent the disease progression in my model? For each of these states, you'll notice, because you can see that visually, that they have different events representing what could happen to a patient who starts in that cycle. So for example, there is the assumption down here that if you're in remission, you can either stay in remission or you can relapse to cancer. And from remission, we're assuming that those are the only things that can happen. And again, you want to check that those are the appropriate elements of disease progression that you want captured in the model. So sometimes it's something that's really useful to do is from a Markov model like this, where you have all the branches to represent their different transitions and events, it's often a very good idea to generate a state transition diagram. And that's going to give you a quick way to summarize what the health states are and the movements between them. And in TreeAge, it's really easy to create a state transition diagram. You just select the Markov node and then you right click and then you hit convert to a state transition diagram. And when I do that, I'll get a window that will pop open and it will be a state transition diagram. So hopefully you can see on your screen now that this is a state transition diagram representation of the Markov model that we had for the standard treatment in the model. And so this will basically tell you what the health states are: cancer stage 1, 2, remission and dead, and show you visually how the patients can move between those different stages. You can't run any analysis on this state transition diagram as such, but it's a really useful tool to conceptually understand what the Markov model is doing that you're looking at. So you can use this as well to get an understanding of the patient pathways before you then go back to the model and then consider sort of the important elements that you have in that, especially around the critical values of, say, cost and effectiveness. So let's just go back to the actual tree version of the model now. So you know that if it's a Markov model, the health states in each Markov model typically have sort of cost and utility values associated with them. They can also be costs and utilities, which could be associated with events that happen in the tree as well. So what you're doing is looking for these things in your model as you see it now. You're looking to see if assignment of costs and things like that has been allocated appropriately, given what you know about being in the different stages of the disease and given what you know about the different treatments that you have as well. So you can look at the model here, and you'll see that there's some boxes below each of the health states, and those are what tells you, they tell you which rewards, so which costs and utilities are associated with each of those health states. And if you wanted to review these and then edit them further, you'll just need to look at your model inputs, and sort of when you're on the Markov node with all the health states, you can look at what's called the Markov info view. So it's the view that's associated directly with the Markov node. And when you select that view, you can go and look at the health states tab, and across here you can see that for cost and utilities for each of the health states you've got, these are the costs that are being accumulated, and these are the units of effectiveness that are being accumulated for each cycle within your model. Okay, so that's sort of another tool within the software to give you a bit of insight into the things that are associated with the health states. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out as well in terms of the structure, so we know that this is a Markov node and a Markov model here, but you'll notice that for the second strategy down here, there's actually no structure visible. And that's because this is a cloned or a synchronized copy of the top strategy. And I know that because there's a reference down here to clone 1, and up here I can see a number 1 and a dark line, which tells me that that's the clone master. So the top strategy has a dark line indicating it's cloned, and then down here, this is where there's a direct copy of that. So you can choose from your tree preferences to be able to see that cloned copy or not. I'm not going to do that in this particular example. But the important thing that I want to take away from this is that both of these strategies, the progression that you have here is identical. Okay, they have identical health states and identical events to represent the patient pathways. But there's going to be important differences. So there's going to be differences between the standard of care and the new therapy. So I'm going to show you some ways that you can look at what those differences are between the health states. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. So once you've got kind of a feeling for the structure and the disease progression, you know the number of strategies you're comparing and the disease progression sort of in the tree, the next thing that we can do is I want to sort of give you an overview of the high level information that goes into the model. And I'm going to show you one of the views that you have in the software, which is called the dashboard. And it's really useful because it gives you a sort of a map to basically find all the high-level information you need about the model. So in your views menu here, where you find all the views that you use to input values into your model and stuff like that, right at the top, or sort of right near the top, you've got one called the dashboard, and we're just going to open that. Okay, and my dashboard has opened up over here on the right-hand side. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move that dashboard sort of just to below the model over here, just by dragging and dropping it, so that you can sort of see all the information that's on there. So if you've never used a dashboard before, I'm just going to explain to you the elements of the dashboard and then how they relate to the model and how you can use them to review a model. Okay, so it's broken into 3 sections. It's the model properties, the model structure and display, and the model inputs. And it's sort of active for whichever tree you have active in the top screen here in your tree editor. So it's got the first section over here, the model properties. It's going to tell you important information about the analysis of your model. So if you look down, you can see here it says calculation method. So it tells me that the calculation method, which is set for the model I've got up here, is cost effectiveness. So I know when it evaluates it, it's going to be compared on the basis of cost effectiveness analysis. Kind of coupled with that, down here, you can see that it's got a willingness to pay. And the willingness to pay is set to be 50,000. So that is going to be used within the model as a threshold on the ISA when it generates your cost effectiveness analysis. Below that, you can see here this link here to global discounting. It tells me in this case it's off. Usually people use global discounting, and if it's on, what would happen is TreeAge Pro would automatically apply discounting to reduce the present value of rewards, so your cost and utilities, as time passes. So that's something else that's really useful to be able to see at a glance from this dashboard here. You can see, hopefully from my screen, that a number of the elements in the dashboard, so especially in the model properties here, are highlighted in blue. And these links take you to the place in the software where you can change the settings related to that feature. So for example, if I wanted to change the willingness to pay, I just click this blue link here, and it's going to open the tree preferences in the model, and this is where the willingness to pay is set. So if I wanted to change the willingness to pay to 30,000, I just enter it in there, hit apply and close, and then the willingness to pay would have changed. The other important thing that you've got over here in your model properties section, if you go sort of down, is it says here requires patient level simulation, and you see it says yes here. So that's really important when we come to analyzing the model, because it tells us that running cohort level analyses, such as things like rollback or any sort of expected value calculations, aren't going to yield appropriate results. So we need to bear that in mind when we eventually come to running this model, once we've understood the structure and what it's doing. Okay, so let's have a look at the next section along. So in the dashboard, the next one is the model structure and display. So this basically highlights element of the model structure and patient pathways that we sort of examined already earlier. Just gives it sort of in a textual view though, the number of decision nodes, we've got 1, number of strategies, we've got 2, number of Markov nodes, 2, etc. It also tells us whether we've got clones, so that's quite useful as well. The links that are really useful down here are the ones that tell you where things are displayed on the model. So you see here you've got variables displayed, notes displayed, Markov Des info displayed, clone copies hidden. So remember before I said, well, we can't see the copy here, but the settings to change that. If you just click the button where it says hidden, it now becomes displayed, and you'll see in your model that the clone copies are now displayed, and you can use the same button to click again and it will hide the model structure. The same for sort of any of the other elements. So the Markov Des info, if you want to hide the Markov info, which is just the information that we had beneath each of the health states about the cost, you can click that button, and then if we click on it again, it will display it. So it's a really nice way to kind of quickly get a be able to turn things on and off within your model. Okay. So again, use those blue links to help you edit things in the model very quickly from the dashboard. The last sort of these 3 sections on the right hand side is the model inputs, and this one's really important. It's going to provide a summary of all the inputs that are required for the model to be calculated. So the most common model inputs you have are variables. So this tells you the number of those that you had, and variables are mostly numeric parameters, most of which are defined at the root node. You can see a lot of them defined over here at the root node, which is the decision node in our tree. You'll notice, however, that some are not defined at the root node and they're defined somewhere else. The definition's not at root node. And these are the ones that are important for that clone, copy, and the clone master. So the differences between the strategies. We'll come back to that in a moment. Below variables, you've got your distributions down here as well. So you've got, they're important to understand because they're going to introduce any sampling that's required in your models. So if you had any that were sampled by expected value, that would mean that you have distributions in there that you can use for doing probabilistic sensitivity analysis. Distributions, if you've got any that are sampled by trial, those ones down there would mean that you were generating patient level characteristics for a kind of a patient level simulation model. So you can use sort of the information that's here tell you what things are in your model before you even look at the distributions. And obviously, if you click the distributions tab, that would take you to the distributions view you've got in your model, and you could find the details about all the distributions you have in your model. And then if we go right down to the bottom, we've got no tables in our model, but we've got what are called trackers. And they're really important because they're used to record patient history. And then they can track things that happen to a patient, generating a history, and then they can be referenced later in the patient's pathway. So we'll come back to that later as well. But when you have trackers in your model, the important thing to remember is that it means that patient level simulation is required. So if the software sees that you've got trackers, it will click over here to yes, the model requires patient level simulation. Okay, so we'll come back to that a little bit later when we run the model. So let's just talk about a couple of those elements that we saw in the dashboard relative to the model now. So within the dashboard, you saw that we had variable definitions that were mostly at the root node, but some were defined differently in the model. And that usually indicates that strategies have different values when you see those kind of things. So because the second strategy down here, the new therapy, is a clone of the standard of care, we need to have different values in these synchronized copies. And you can see below each of the strategies variables that are defined differently. So we have got here the cost of being in stage 1 cancer and the probability of progression used in this tree here are defined differently between the standard of care and the new therapy. Okay, so that gives you an indication of how these treatments are different. They have different costs and different probability of progressions. And when you analyze the model, what that's going to provide is different results for each strategy based on those different inputs. In this case, there are only those two things that are different, but it would depend on the disease you were modeling and of course the drug or the strategy that was in place as to how many things would be different between each of the strategies. Okay, so that's kind of why the variables being different are important, and that's what you can see visually here and through the dashboard. And then in addition to that, we also saw on the dashboard that when we're running the model, it's going to require patient simulation. Now, that's important because it's a difference between the model being evaluated by expected value type calculations, where you just generate the average of a cohort, or by patient level simulation, where you run individual patients through the model. And if the model includes patient history, which impacts the patient pathways, then we should be able to run individuals through the model. So let's look at kind of what that is. So the things that we highlight in the dashboard related to patient level simulation, you could have patient characteristics, and usually they are defined through having distributions that are sampled for every trial within the model. So things like age or gender, those are the things that you would use in the model that would be describe characteristics of the individuals. We don't have any within this model. Okay, so there's no characteristics. The element that we do have captured in this model is what we call is patient history. And I said that those things are going to be captured through what we call trackers. And specifically in this model, we're going to use trackers to record events that may occur in a patient's pathway and affect their future events. So what I'm going to show you is just the trackers view down here. So I don't have it open, and if you haven't used a simulation model before, you wouldn't necessarily. So in the views menu here, you can just go down to the view called tracker properties. And if you open tracker properties, you'll see we have one tracker created, and it's called T relapse. And if I select T relapse and hit this little highlight, it highlights where it's used within the tree. So you can see right here, I have what's called a tracker modification. So that tells me when in the model the tracker is updated. So I'm capturing here how many, whether I've had a relapse or not to cancer. Okay, that's what that tracker is capturing there. I can also search for this tracker and see where it's used in the model. And I can use this doing this little find reference in tree. It's like a little search light in the software. And if I click that, a little search reference will appear up over here on the right hand side. And it tells me anywhere that tracker is used within the model. So you can see I've got a couple of definitions within the model. The probability of dying from stage 1 cancer, and also the probability of progression impacted by whether I relapse or not. Okay, so it just helps you look for where that tracker is used within your model. So it's a really, really nice tool. You can use the search for anything. You can just use it from up here and click search and type in anything. So any of your variables, any word or any name you have in your model, you can type in here. And then when you hit search, the search will come up here and show you all of that information. Okay, so what that tells me now is that I've got patient history of when the patient had a relapse captured here, and then I've got a number of calculations within the model that are based on that relapse. So the probability of progression is based on that relapse, and the probability of dying from stage 1 cancer is also based on that that tracker in this model. So that's how you would use the trackers to find things within the model. So all of this information that we've got now leads us to how we need to analyze the model. Usually I'd presume when you've got a model, there would be some description about how to run the analysis, but we're kind of assuming not here. So you now know that this model needs to be run via microsimulation or patient level simulation. So all the analysis that you would need are basically found in the analysis menu. So you'd go up to the analysis menu up here, and then we look for what's called Monte Carlo simulation, so kind of running individuals through your model. And then we hit trials, and then what you can do in here is run a given number of trials through the model. So I'm just going to run 1,000 individuals through the model. And typically when you run trials through the model, you probably run many more to generate your expected value calculations, because you're kind of looking for an average across your population. I just wanted to run fairly quickly so that I could kind of demonstrate where to look for the next things. So the primary output that you get here is your cost effectiveness analysis outputs. So over here on the right hand side, what you're usually looking for is your rankings report, and that will tell you what your ISA is, comparing your two strategies, your standard of care and your new therapy, and you can compare that to your willingness to pay. Okay, so these costs here and effectiveness are the average cost and effectiveness across the 1,000 patients you have run through each strategy within your model. Okay, so that's kind of your high level report that you'd want to get out of your model. If you wanted to dig deeper, you could also look at what's called time reports. So within here, I've got time reports turned on within the software, and then I can look at sort of generating a cohort type report for let's say the new strategy, the new therapy, which will show me where all the individual patients were as they move through the model. And then I can generate the state prob curves from that to show me the proportion of my population who were in different health states as time advanced through the model. Okay, these reports are automatically generated for any cohort models you do. And if you're running a microsimulation model, as I did here, you'll see that there's this time reporting option here, and I just have to turn that on in tree preferences to be able to capture that additional data for every trial going through the model. And if you look at the previous webinar, we go into great detail about what time reporting is and how to capture that. Okay, so at this in this webinar, I'm just kind of giving you an overview of those things that are available. But here you can see obviously your state prob curves for the proportion of your population is in each of the health states as time goes on. In this case, it was the new therapy. Okay. All right. So in addition to sort of looking at these kind of high-level built-in analysis that we have in TreeAge Pro, you may want to look sort of beyond these general reports that you can generate. And I've already set the model up to actually look at internal calculations based on the tracker T relapse. So in the model that I've got, I have used a setting that's in tree preferences under analysis called debugging. So what debugging will allow you to do is it will allow you to select certain elements of your model and see all of those internal calculations. Again, there's another webinar that goes into this in detail, but you just need to know it's there and that you can use it. And you'll see that over here on the right hand side, I've generated internal calculations to be sent to this console over here. So basically every time we need to calculate something that depends on the relapse, so the tracker that we have for the relapse, we can check that the calculations are using that value correctly. And it just gives you another level of depth to your analysis. Okay, so again, that's just running the base case, getting your expected value calculations from a patient level simulation model. The final thing that you're probably going to want to do or want to be able to run on any model that you're reviewing is be able to examine the impact of changes into model inputs. For example, imagine that you change the cost of a new treatment. How does it impact the model and the conclusions? One easy way to do that is to run what we call a tornado diagram, which is basically going to generate a collection of one-way sensitivity analysis. So for this particular model, you'd go up to your analysis menu, look at sensitivity analysis and select tornado diagram. And then you'll have an option of, for the variables that you care about changing, in this case I've got probabilities and different costs in here, I can change them over a given range and then I can run the tornado analysis. And I've done that already before I came to the webinar. And so you get a screen like this, which will then allow you to generate a tornado diagram so you can see what the ISO tornado looks like for your standard of care versus your new therapy. And you can look at sort of what the thresholds are there and how varying different costs or probabilities within your model impact your confidence in the results. Okay, so that's the tornado diagram, which is again built-in calculations. If you want to do more than the deterministic sensitivity analysis, so one-way, two-way tornado diagrams, you can incorporate distributions into your model. So again, when you look at that dashboard, you'd have distributions in there which would be created. And those distributions would be sample per expected value, and that would tell you that you'd be able to run probabilistic sensitivity analysis on your model. Again, at the click of a button, you go to the analysis menu, you run cost effectiveness, you run Monte Carlo simulation and generate probabilistic sensitivity analysis. Okay, so that is the content of the reviewer webinar. I hope that I've given you sort of a high level overview of the different tools that are available in TreeAge when a model lands on your desk and you don't know where to start in terms of understanding what it's doing. I guess the takeaways are: use the structure that you have to understand the disease progression. Use the dashboard as well, which is a great way to kind of understand what's going on in your model, and then use the links within there to get you to different points in the model. All of the analysis you need are going to be in the analysis menu. So again, once you understand how the model can be run from using the dashboard, you should be able to run analysis and then change them in terms of the sensitivity analysis. So if there's any elements of what you've got in here that you'd like a little bit of a deeper dive into, I really encourage you to look at the previous webinars that we've done. And we've also got a number of tutorials on our websites as well that you can look at to do that. So I'm going